I want to open up this opus of Triloquy with a quote, Scott, from one of our so-called founding fathers, George Washington. He once said, "It's better to offer no excuse than a bad one." Let's get into it. I'm Garrett McQueen.
I'm Scott Blankenship.
And this is Triloquy, true and real stories from the fringes of classical music, the final opus of Triloquy for Black History Month. I hope you've learned something this Black History Month, maybe discovered something that you hadn't thought of before.
Of course.
Yeah, and it's been a great month with some really great guests. So if you missed any of the Black History Month opuses of Triloquy, I encourage you to go back and check them out at TRILLOQUY.org. Also, some really great videos cultivated this month, including an excerpt from Dream Variations by Damian Strange. And this week, there's a video of an improvisation between DeVon Russell Gray, a friend of the show, and today's guest, whose name is Davu Seru. What did you think about our conversation with Davu before we get into it?
Davu is one of those sorts of people that when you sit down, there are no short conversations.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Davu doesn't speak, he elocutes. You know, he's very... He's telling stories in each answer, you know, and I guess that speaks to the fact that he's a literature professor. So
right, over at Hamlin University, I believe. So shout out to them, a local university here to Minnesota. Also a gardener, which he goes into in his Minnesota Originals, produced by the local public television station. Who and you can check out a link to that in the description of this opus. And also a really cool musician. You know, he describes himself as a jazz improviser, and in the conversation, you'll hear him refer to that word jazz as just a placeholder. And I know that Scott, here on the podcast, we've already explored, you know, jazz and what it means in one of our Black History opuses. But what did you think about his take on that, jazz as just a placeholder and still not a really great way to describe the sort of music that he produces?
I think that he gets to the point of a lot of the conversations that we have about music classification and how there aren't any hard lines, you know, that there's shades of gray that get us into jazz improvisation and then back into something like classical. But, you know, I think that it's good that he's blurring those lines.
Yeah, and as much as we explore the implications of the word classical, the phrase classical music, he takes that a step further in questioning the implications of the word composition, how he composes music off the page, how his music is off the page. And I think that was another really interesting thing about the conversation. One thing I want to underscore that you'll hear in this opus, that you'll hear from Davu, is thinking about your own barriers to art. So I'll be the first to say that the piece of music that closes out this opus and the Black History Month opuses of Triloquy, it may be pretty different for a lot of people. It may be even a little challenging for some people, but it's important, you know, to discover and explore again your own barriers, our own barriers that set us apart from new and different styles of music.
This is where both DeVon Gray and Davu Seru are in their life. This is everything that they have studied and played leading up to this moment. And watch the video, because the communication that is happening between these two, I would say, is just as important as the communication and concentration that you might see people play in a symphony orchestra. They are making faces at one another. They're giving each other physical cues as to where they are in this improvised composition. It's amazing to watch.
Absolutely. And you, Scott, you really do a great job of producing and shooting those videos. So
thanks,
again, that's available for you at TRILLOQUY.org. Before we get into the conversation with Davu, Scott, we have to rehash some of our previous drama. So back on Opus 37 of Triloquy, TRILLOQUY, which featured Sam Bergman. We talked for a little bit about a piece of music called the American Rhapsody, music of Samuel Coleridge-Taylor, an Afro-English composer, matched with the words of George Washington. And this is narrated by Aaron Dworkin, the founder of the Sphinx organization based over in Detroit. I want to read the quote that I started this opus out with, again, of George Washington. It says, "It is better to offer no excuse than a bad one." So, and if you want the real deep dive on this conversation, I encourage you to go to Opus 37 of TRILLOQUY. I also wrote about it in my blog at GarrettMcQueen.com if you want to dig through and find that. But I think it's really interesting for that George Washington quote to exist, considering what the American Rhapsody is referring to. So, Scott, if you remember, it's about George Washington and how in his will he said that he wanted to emancipate all of his slaves upon the death of his wife, Martha. So is that not an excuse? Should George Washington have just let go of his slaves? I mean, surely he had the power to, right?
Why would he wait until his wife died?
Well, because, I guess they had some work to do that he didn't want his wife to do. And, on further reading of George Washington's will, which I'll post a link to in the description of this, it goes on to talk about how all of the people under his purview weren't even eligible to be freed based on the will that he wrote, So again, you have George, from my perspective and from the perspective of many, because a lot of people have written to me and said that I need to bring this back up on TRILLOQUY because lots of orchestras are picking up this piece of music. To tie this in with Davu, I'm thinking about my own barriers. What are the barriers between me and this piece of music? Am I being able to enjoy this piece of music? Well, for me, it's using the words of George Washington that, even in the performance of the piece, if you take a listen to it, outline the excuses he had concerning not freeing his slaves. It's a really important conversation that's happening all over the internet, all over the orchestral fields. Folks I work with and folks I see. So I'm not going to sit here and slam the composition because the actual music by Samuel Coleridge-Taylor is quite beautiful. But again, I think for me it's missing the mark. I think it's in more ways than one. There are presidents that Samuel Coleridge-Taylor actually had a relationship with, namely Roosevelt. Roosevelt invited Samuel Coleridge-Taylor to the White House, I think, in 1903 and 1904. You have him. You have the plethora of black poets and black artists who might have words to offer. I don't know. It's just weird for me for the words of a slave owner to be used to prop up how we can become a better people and how he was a victim of his time. And if it was really up to him, he could have set all of these people free. Well, was it not up to him? I don't know. I guess I'll leave room for you to offer us some feedback. Go find the American Rhapsody. I think there's a performance of it at this time on YouTube. Take a listen and tell us how you feel about it. Maybe you disagree. Maybe you think that it's a fine piece of music, that it's just fine to include words of a slave owner and tie it in with music of an Afro-English composer. I'll let you decide.
When we were talking with Sam Bergman, he said that the performance being tied to some young black voice actors on the stage, they were actually students that the Minnesota Orchestra had collaborated with.
Right, and this was at the performance that I saw,
right. But he also said that as an organization, if someone perceives a misfire, they want to know about it. So is there any way that these other orchestras that are including this in an upcoming season, is there any way in your view that they can avoid a misfire and still perform the music?
Thank you so much for that question, because that leads me down a number of holes, rabbit holes and pathways. My short answer is that we always have to be vocal, that we can't be shy about reaching out to each other and reaching out to our local and national arts organizations and letting our perspectives be known. I even said this on my personal Facebook page, I think sometime last week. As much as I enjoy enjoy getting the DMs and the emails saying, what do you think about this? Something has to be done. I really love that, and that's what I use this platform for.
Right.
But these days, everyone has a platform with social media, with the way that classical music works. You have a voice, and it is so important for you to speak up. So again, I really invite you to take a listen to the American Rhapsody. You can find it on YouTube, and let us know what you think. If you think it's great, let us know. If you think it's horrible, let us know. But don't just talk to us about it. Talk to your local organizations to make sure that your voice is heard and that more of what you think and more that what you feel in the world of classical music can make it through to the concert stage. And I think that's my spiel on that. Again, if you want the deep dive, you can go check out Opus 37 of TRILLOQUY featuring Sam Bergman. But Scott, as a sort of transition, I would like to celebrate Samuel Coleridge-Taylor a bit, again, with this being the final opus of TRILLOQUY for Black History Month, an Afro-English composer who really believed not only in his African heritage, but in the fight for equality and civil rights here in America. He was really a figure who viewed the African diaspora as a global thing and people whose rights need to be fought for globally. And on his trip or not long after his trip to the United States, he wrote a series of pieces for violin and piano that he called African Dances. And thanks to Rachel Barton Pine, this music has finally been recorded, and a really great way for us to celebrate the relationship between Black history, Black music history, and this genre of music that's called classical music. So I'd like for us to take a listen to just a quick excerpt from the first of those African Dances by Samuel Coleridge-Taylor as we transition into our conversation with Mr. Davu Seru. Davu Seru, it is beyond an honor for you to be here on TRILLOQUY. Thanks so much for coming in today.
Thank you.
So we were first connected at the American Composers Forum convening some months ago. And one of the first things I wanted to ask you was about institutional involvement in these large racial equity conversations. It's one thing for there to be grassroots initiatives, but what are your opinions on large white-led institutions like the ACF really being a bastion for this sort of change? Because, at the end of the day, we wouldn't have been connected without that convening after all. Maybe not as soon as we were anyway.
Well, I think it's honorable to some degree. That is when practiced by the most sincere institutions out there. But I also think that I think about my relationship to larger art institutions the same way that some musicians have thought about their relationship to music industry. And so they can only do so much for me, but they are the embodiment of, capital. They are the gateway. There is money. There are writers writing about it. There are venues. There are touring circuits. There are managers. And so I'm going to be going and asking for access to those things as long as people pretend that they are there for those who are worthy and will show up to get them. But I understand their role to be pretty limited to the extent that they spend most of their time funding projects and not patronizing artists over the course of their careers.
Sure.
So they can only be so useful. Really, it's about artists working to decide for themselves in community what needs to be done.
Sure.
The institutions can support, again, projects that we might take on, but projects really only lend to the production of shiny objects, and I'm only so interested in that. I'm about practice and time, the time that it ultimately takes to affect change in ways that are serviceable. And institutions are about pleasing their boards typically, and their fundraisers or their funders, which is the business of commerce. And so, again, as an artist, that is a conversation that some people are supposed to have, not me. uh,
Sure.
yeah.
Yeah, and we're definitely going to talk about the ways you use the word community, and I'm really curious the ways in which you tie your art with community. But you also used the word access, and Scott, that's something that we talk a lot about,
Quite a
especially
bit.
as an entry point into the arts. So I'm curious, what was your entry point into the arts? Do you remember the first time you picked up an instrument, or the first time you heard sounds that were really interesting to you that you wanted to be involved in?
Interesting point, because I'm currently developing a piece, and I got Kenna Cotman, the wonderful Kenna Cotman, to agree to participate on it with me. I'm developing a piece that'll premiere in June that is paying homage to an aunt of mine who was not a biological aunt, nor an aunt through marriage. She was brought into the family via my grandmother, who was an immigrant to the Twin Cities from Iowa. Came here after the Second World War, and eventually was in a girls' home because the kids were homeless and on the streets of Minneapolis, and got swooped up by the social, by the state, and put into homes. And my grandmother met this woman named Phyllis Austin, who hipsters would call a folk artist.
Okay.
Phyllis was our babysitter. Phyllis would collect bags of, a newspaper, wherein she had news clippings and stamps and crushed eggshells, and she collected glitter and yarn and pipe cleaners.
Yeah.
And she would make things, including sort of cards commemorating holidays and birthdays and things for family. She would take and copy an image, mimic an image from a magazine or a newspaper of praying hands, and paint them black or brown, excuse me, for Black people. And she was the first I'd ever identified. It was through her that I ever identified as an artist first,
Oh,
as
wow.
a child. And so I thought that I would be a painter for the rest of my life. And Phyllis is the reason for that. I started playing the drums one cold and ugly winter because my stepfather, who was a dope dealer, exchanged for a drum kit. And so there were drums in my house all of a sudden in the early 80s, and they were sitting behind the dining room table in the apartment where we lived above Aunt Phyllis and my Uncle Jamie and Georgia, these three elder queer folks who were a literal foundation in this case, since we lived up above them in this duplex, and central figures in my family, especially when it came to the kids. And so Phyllis was my entrance into the arts, but it was, again, through a kind of, technocratic, I'm good at this particular skill. Look at how well I render this image, represent this likeness. And how well I'm able to articulate and connect with family and community through art. Because, again, her audience was limited to family
Sure.
and friends. It was not, she had no ambition to hang her works in a gallery anywhere. And so now, though, I'm developing a piece, I'm taking it into the high art world as a way to remember Phyllis Austin and that and her role in my life as an artist, who is becoming more and more being made busier by institutions as I move into the second half of my career as an artist.
Sure. It's, what an origin story. And, what comes to mind, back to my initial question about institutional involvement, certain institutions not being able to understand the implications of a journey that starts like that. What comes to mind immediately is Jay-Z. And there are certain folks in the media that just don't want anyone to forget that, he sold drugs once upon a time. Yeah. But that origin story is very important to his journey and what it means for him to be the artist that he is. I'm wondering if you think of your journey in a similar way at all.
Well, Horatio Alger's The Rags to Riches tale, Benjamin Franklin did it, Booker T. Washington did it, everybody now with this who reads a self-help book that's on the whatever Times uh, 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 top bestseller list,
Right. Yeah.
can aspire to the same, the bootstrap thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I defied the odds in my life. I've sublimated. I've gone from destitution to some degree of success, I guess. Some of your audience might not know that I'm a professor of literature by day at Hamline University, and the rest of the time, when I'm not fathering, gardening, husbanding, when I'm not teaching or being a scholar, I'm composing music, because otherwise, I feel like, I mean, these are generative practices. They're about live life.
Yeah.
The opposite of what I spent my childhood evading.
Sure. Sure.
So, I'm grateful. I'm grateful for the life that I've managed to land into.
This month on TRILLOQUY with our guests for Black History Month, in addition to learning about who they are and their art, I have personally, I can say I've been given the opportunity to get an inside look at some of the Twin Cities Black communities. And, before moving here, I didn't know that the Twin Cities, that Minnesota would have a Black community, much less Black communities. And the one that you come from maybe is a little different than the ones that have existed historically here in St. Paul. You're from across the river over in Minneapolis.
I am, and my relationship to the historic Rondo community is distant, and so I won't try to speak of it. I mean, the major, say, point on the local timeline for Rondo is the displacement of the community that the interstate caused. But there was also displacement in North Minneapolis that we don't talk about very much.
Where you're from.
Where I'm from. My family landed in, again, North Minneapolis after the Second World War, and it lived really close to what was called Sixth Avenue, which doesn't exist anymore, but was considered the Negro Vice area. Of the near north side, just northwest of downtown Minneapolis. There was a cushion of industrial, junkyards and such between the neighborhood, which sort of the local imaginary begins with the Sumner housing projects and Sumner Field, which had, a Jewish community that was replaced by a Black community, and then a Hmong community. I was born in the Sumner housing projects in 1978 and grew up hearing stories about the old Sixth Avenue, where a number of my family members worked in the sex industry. But it was W. Harry Davis talks about it in his memoirs. Gordon Parks played piano in a brothel along Sixth Avenue, a brothel owned by a man named Pope. He talks about it in his autobiography, Choice of Weapons. It was where, there's some sociologists who refer to these kinds of neighborhoods as interzones. They are, by and large, Black, identified, but places that draw white people.
Sure.
Who have some interest in vice. And so, I've talked to family who'd say, no, everybody was there, baby. Priests, soldiers, businessmen, they'd come on Friday, they wouldn't leave till Sunday. And so my family came up around that area, but that area was replaced, including any number of jazz venues and restaurants and businesses and things when 94 came through, and people started to move, to disperse further into the north side, and there have always been different northern boundaries: Plymouth, Broadway, 26th, then it was Brooklyn Center, and now Brooklyn Center and Brooklyn Park are home to more Black people in Minnesota than the north side.
Wow.
So my mom left the north side maybe 5-6 years ago and is now in the inner ring suburbs. Our inner ring suburbs are becoming like the suburbs of Paris. People have decided they want the city back, people who left, and so our poorest people are being pushed to the inner ring suburbs. And so North Minneapolis, the North Minneapolis I grew up in, has changed a great deal, and much of it has moved on.
I wonder if your development as a musician and as an artist growing up was impacted by that continual shift. Were there resources that slowly went away, or maybe resources that slowly came into the picture? How was your development impacted by that?
So, I mean, before we started the interview, we were talking a lot about Chicago because Chicago has left a great mark on the Twin Cities, the culture of Chicago, people who came from Chicago. In the 80s and 90s, along Plymouth Avenue, which again at that point was the sort of northern border, I suppose Broadway was. There was a gap between them. There were a number of black-owned businesses along Plymouth Avenue. We had a roller skating rink. We had a grocery store. We had a law office. There was, famously, there's the funeral home, which is one of two businesses that exist from that time, extant from that time. A funeral home, it's in its third, I think, remodel and expansion, right? The funeral home. And then the Elks Club would be the other. And it is a Black Elks Club, one of those minority of Elks Clubs that the country can lay claim to. My family were members of the Elks Club. The Elks Club is where you would go to drink as a Black person who wanted to drink around other Black people, who was barred from doing so in the other venues, or literally through a kind of Jim Crow light, or because there were no Black-owned bars until much later when Cassius opened. I believe it was Cassius Bar. There just weren't places for people to convene. So much of that early, what I'd call nostalgic sort of Plymouth Avenue, the Black-owned businesses, that would start to dwindle in the early 90s as the gangs and the police laid claim to the land, and the rest of us became civilians in a war zone.
And you put them beside it. You said the gangs and the police.
And the police, yes. One was policing the distribution of crack cocaine. The other was policing the protection of property. So they were protecting property. And so then some of us were civilians. I was a little boy coming of age in that time and had the one goal of getting out of the neighborhood by the time I was able to at 18. And I did. I left. I got out. It was too much. And I needed to find, and I had sort of this abject relationship to my neighborhood that caused me, I left. I moved to the other side of the skyscrapers, remember noting the fact that the skyline was flipped in reverse.
Sure. Yeah.
All of a sudden.
Yeah.
And I was reoriented. I had a different orientation vis-a-vis my home. But it was also, when I went from north to south, opportunities began to emerge where I had felt previously that everyone was saying no, stop. Opportunities began to emerge, and I began to identify slowly as a citizen of the world, and not just my mama's house, and not just my native land. And in terms of how that impacted my art, well, people took me more seriously outside the neighborhood. The day I graduated from North High in 1996, I remember all the people I'd had beef with for 4 years coming up, and everyone sharing hugs and saying, "What are you going to do now?" And these are the kids now who went to North High, who had come from middle-class Black families. Sure. I did not. Who were off to Black colleges in the South. By and large, they were getting out of Minnesota. They were leaving, and they were all headed off to college, and I was going off to the South Side to make art. And
you were headed south, just not as far south as they were.
Just to the South Side to make art, and then eventually Chicago, and then eventually the world. So the world, according to France and some other places. So how has it impacted my artistry, my work as an artist? Those shifts, those changes. I remember the first time. Well, I grew up taking kind of Black vernacular culture for granted. It wouldn't occur to me until I found myself surrounded by white people that, there were some things that we did. until I found myself surrounded by white people and then eventually in school, that there were things that we had been participating in all the time that would rise to the level of interest
Yeah.
that we just took for granted, like oral tales of, there's a number of tales that go under there was a white man, black man, Chinese man, just like there was a
Okay.
priest, rabbi, and a bishop or whatever I forget the form.
Yeah.
We had those, I was a B-boy, breakdancing, riding on people's walls. My friends were DJs and barbers, and everybody thought they could rap. And we're listening to Miles Davis and Thelonious Monk and identifying. Remember, this is the Coast Wars, so Black identity mediated by music industry, who was telling us that there was an East Coast and a West Coast who was at war, and so we bought that because the gangs in our neighborhood identified with West Coast gangster rap. We identified with what we presume to be more creative, coming out of the New York City,
Sure.
and more cosmopolitan. And more conscious and positive. And so there was that tension in the neighborhood. I remember having to sort out when somebody in blue would approach you in your red baseball cap that was cocked the wrong angle, toward the wrong angle, and they would correct you. There was, we're living out, the things that I spend most of my time as a scholar studying and teaching about now. You took them for granted. When I left, and found myself surrounded by white people in an arts community with a capital A, it would be a while before I started to look back and go, oh, wait a minute. We have a presence here that I don't think other people, that I haven't acknowledged, and I'm certain other people haven't.
Yeah.
That's remained illegible. I think there's something about proximity and our closeness and proximity that has us take for granted what we think we know about one another. And I'm claiming that Black culture in the Twin Cities has remained illegible to the Twin Cities. And much of the work that I feel like I'm doing now is about making it more legible. So my work as an artist is directly connected with what is the movement of people and culture in this place. So that we can achieve something that's sustainable, that isn't so reliant on institutions.
Right.
That's more self-determined. This we learned from the Black Arts Movement, I would call it 1965 to 1980, when Black people, like they had done in the 20s, during in the 40s. During the New Negro Renaissance and the Chicago Renaissance.
Known to many people as the Harlem Renaissance.
The Harlem Renaissance, yes, and then the Chicago Renaissance. Well, one of the reasons that some of us like to decenter Harlem is because, think about it, Harlem, jazz. Jazz got to St. Louis and Kansas City and Chicago before it got to New York City, right? It followed the Mississippi River from the south, right? And so the Harlem Renaissance is a misnomer invented in the 1970s. The New Negro Renaissance was happening more broadly. There was a patron from Minneapolis of the Harlem Renaissance, who's I forget, it's not Meridel Lesueur, it's someone else I think, who had funded in part Fire, which was the preeminent journal of the younger set of Black artists in Harlem at the time, Wallace Thurman and Langston Hughes or Neil Hurston and Bruce Nugent and them. So decentering Harlem to show that this is a broader. Harlem was just one articulation of that movement. Chicago was of the Black Arts movement. The Twin Cities had a Black Arts movement. Prince emerged from it. We don't talk about it in those terms because Prince is our Prince means everything. He's not just Black. Well, that afro he died with ought to suggest something to you.
And the work that he was very vocal in with Black Lives Matter toward the ends there. So. Scott, what all of this is reminding me of is the question that I had prepared to ask all of the guests this month, which is what is wrong with the idea of Black History Month and what is wrong with the way we treat it. And you're laying that out there right now. So much of this Black history that is not explored nationally, much less here locally. I mean, you say Black history in the Twin Cities is illegible.
It is, in part because of our farsightedness, is the other way I like to think about it. The triumphant, heroic Olympian victories of the past, Freddie McGee, Gertrude Brown, the ways in which we've slowly, very slowly dealt with the lynching in Duluth, Dred Scott at Fort Snelling. We like to look at things that happen that as things that are mark racial sort of high points in local history that seem to have happened long ago. Race is annoying. Race is annoying for Black people too. We don't, race is annoying. And so people don't like to talk about it or deal with it, except for to put the onus on Black people when, as Du Bois said in Souls of Black Folk, about the Negro problem. I don't have a problem.
Yeah.
The Negro problem is a white problem. It's not mine. It's no, you need to deal with race. As much as we talk about it, you need to deal with it as well. That is the person who is charging us with being overly conscious of race or whatever, overly conscious of what it means to live in this body in this place.
Sure.
And so,
I kind of wanted to, transition a little bit. When you talk about, the history behind what is what are the Black communities here in the Twin Cities. Before we turned on the microphone, you talked about how lots of your people came from down south, some of which from my hometown of Memphis. And when I think about Black connections to the South, no matter where you live in the country, and sort of the culture that surrounded that, I can't help but to think about the fact that in your Minnesota originals, produced by the public television here, you start by comparing your music and your artistry to gardening. My grandmother, both of my grandmothers who are still living, and my great grandmothers who have gone now, were very much attached to the earth. In that way, William Grant Still even described his first symphony, the Afro-American Symphony, as portraying the sons of the soil who still retain so many of the traits of their African forebears. Is really having your hands and your mind in the soil, literally and figuratively, something that is still a part of your life? And if so, why does it remain such an important part of your life?
Oh yeah, my tomato seeds will go in the window. They'll go in the window in the next couple of weeks.
Okay.
I'll be putting them in the window. No, it's something I didn't discover about myself until me and my wife purchased a home and decided to make a home in Frogtown. But no one in my family gardened. I don't remember spending much time thinking about the yard at home. I did, however, grow up. Again, I'm looking back at my own innocence at a time in North Minneapolis's history when it wasn't an odd thing for a Black kid to walk, kind of cover a 20-block radius on foot with your friends or on bikes that would include Theodore Worth Park. And we'd go into the woods and poke at sunnies and bluegills in the stream over by the Glenwood-Inglewood water filtration place across from the lake. And I'd come out of the woods and there'd be a native garden. There'd be a garden with plants marked in Latin names, Echinacea and Rudbeckia, etc., sedum. And you'd wonder about these things. You'd go up to Ella Louise or Butler, the wildflower garden, again on bikes, and people would chase you out. There was I count it as, like I do drumming or music, a meditative practice. It's not that is becoming increasingly sacred.
Yeah.
My family's relationship to land, I only recently learned something about, and that is the family who's still in the South, in the Memphis area,
Sure.
who, going back to the Civil War, have been sitting on hundreds of acres of land that their grandfather began to, my grandfather's grandfather began to accumulate after the war. And the young people don't seem to want anything to do with it. There are a lot of elders around in their 80s and 90s who are sitting on the land, waiting for folks to come back from the city to take responsibility for the land that their family toiled over, but the land that they own that kept them from, as my grandfather would put it, from book debt. save them from the kind of book debt, that relationship to sharecropping that is so familiar to so many families who eventually left
Right.
and came north.
Right, right. Yeah, some of mine included. My grandmother tells stories about sharecropping and about the money that their family did not receive in the process, and how that had an effect on their relationship with that land, and why I don't have any sort of relationship with it. But again, thinking about the garden, the land, the soil as that metaphor, so much planning, so much practice. I don't have much of a green thumb, but it seems like so much planning and practice goes into it. And I find this interesting, paired beside your music, that by and large, I feel like you describe as improvisatory.
Oh yeah,
You know,
certainly. Yeah.
the sort of, the relationship between kind of going with the flow musically, but being very well planned on the other side of
I'm an
things.
improvising composer. I've embodied, I'm only 40. I'll be 42 in a couple months, 42 years old, but I've paid attention over the course of my life. I've tried. And I carry some things with me that as I'm improvising, as I'm composing, are worked out in real time. That time wherein we attend to the present moment as much as we can. Composition for posterity's sake is of some interest, but performance is everything for the work that I do. I'm not a composer for the page. Performance is everything. It is ritual practice as much as it is commerce between audience and performer. We insist that it be. We insist that it be. That's how it is.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's just, oh, you're a musician like the rest of them, competing for in the same gigging economy that the rest of them are. And I know some of us are oriented a bit differently, and we take seriously things like these life affirming processes like gardening.
Yeah.
That are sometimes that we can invite people into, so that we can figure out where we've been, where we're at, and where we're going. Ward off the hellhounds and all that in the process.
I am not a page. I love that phrase. I'm going to use that again because that's really important. And the word composer, composing. We began by talking about the American Composers Forum and how that organization is addressing the implications of words like composer. What's your relationship with that word? I mean, obviously you don't think of composition again as something that is on the page. You take that word and bring it to life, for lack of a better word.
Certainly, and don't forget that the Composers Forum and organizations like them are only making that distinction now because we've forced them to. As a composer, I mean, I didn't start calling myself a composer until I got my first gig, my first commission as a composer. And so I had now the time to sit and think about what it meant. As an improviser, among improvisers, we consider what we do to be composition and spontaneous composition in real time. Again, we are the archive of music history.
Yeah.
Each and every one of us who conjures some bit of it for whatever the occasion, for the occasion.
Yeah.
And composition as it relates to so-called classical music, and so therefore somebody's theory of civilization that doesn't include difference, but the city of God idea, the wherein we're in this walled city where everything is provided for, and all we have to do now is contemplate the wonders of art. Right, for its own sake, devoid of difference, the kind of difference that causes anxiety, the kind of difference that caused T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound and the Iowa voter so much anxiety the last election. And so what we do is we go to that singular monastic, that gives us a sense of identity. That resolves the tensions that arise because of difference. Classical to me, I mean, people have problematized the term classical going back for a time now. The book Black Athena meant to do that and meant to demystify the power, right, of Greco-Roman history had wielded for so long as this white endeavor in the eyes of the academies.
Yeah.
Right? Not instead of a Mediterranean
Sure.
cultural phenomenon.
Sure.
Right? That was about people moving around, travel, migration. It's kind of like the conversation that we started having about Black people who move here to the Twin Cities from elsewhere and bring assumptions about Black life and identity with them. And the local Blacks go, okay, yes, and. Yes, and. Let us now tell you something about who we are, and how what you might find here in this place. So that demystifying the kind of, again, power that is transplanted from elsewhere is important work. It's important that we historicize it. We don't just bounce around as if we're the ones making it up whole cloth, reinventing the wheel at every turn. No, I am not original. I don't pretend to be. I am the current manifestation of, these forces, articulated in a way that suggests me or my signature. So,
and as planted as you are and your experiences are here in Minnesota, you've done some travel yourself, including working with folks all the way in France. I wonder how that happened. What initiated such a big move like that? I've never been to France.
So there's a friend of mine who's a producer who started coming to the Twin Cities over a decade ago, perhaps well over a decade ago, I don't remember, who discovered the local music scene and was quite impressed. And decided, because he was coming back, because he had a child living here, he'd be coming back periodically, well, why not get involved? And there was a festival that developed out of it that put local musicians in dialogue with folks coming in from elsewhere in the country and in Europe and in the UK. I received a grant that was wherein I'd been recommended by another Black musician on the scene for a grant. And they asked me, what would you do with it? And I said, well, over the years, I've played with a number of musicians, European musicians who after or during the 1960s, in response to the Black arts movement, in response to Albert Ayler and John Coltrane and Alice Coltrane, et cetera, had to figure out who they were, where they lived. And so there's this thing called free improvisation, which some people know about. And groups like the Spontaneous Music Ensemble and AMM are representative of that type. Those folks had been coming over and touring the States and occasionally stopping in the Twin Cities and interacting with us. I said to this granting institution, I would go over there. Now that I can afford it. And so they said, okay, signed off on it. And I called my friend who had been responsible for the festival here and said, hey, I'm coming over. I got money. You don't have to pay for it. Would you put something together? And he put together a recording session, a tour. I got to make a record playing a drum set that belongs to Roy Haynes, the wonderful master of bebop drumming. They played with everybody from Billie Holiday to Duke Ellington to Monk. He's still around, but now retired from drumming. But he had a kit that lived in a recording studio outside of Paris, where I'd happened to be making this record, and so I got to make it on Roy Haynes' kit.
Wow.
That was wonderful, wonderful experience. And then since that first trip, I've gone back 4 or 5 times, going again in the fall, to work with a group of people in a small medieval community in Trignac who throw a festival. But then I also make a trip up to a commune, an infamous commune in a place called Tarnac, where there are people who have set out on the city of God idea themselves, but around a different focus. Where we talk about this business of music and art and is in relationship to history and change. Change from the frog's perspective, as Nietzsche would have put it, from below. So and thanks to the Black history
that, the holes that were filled in that way, the bits of Black history that I did learn about concerning France's relationship with Black folk, I can't help but to think of Josephine Baker.
Yes,
I
sir.
think of Scott. I think of Edmond Dede, whose music that we play. He's someone who went over to France because of what was going on over here. You're going across the Atlantic. Wasn't the reasons weren't exactly the same, but surely you draw some similarities there.
The piece that I told you about, Dead King Mother,
Mm-hmm.
which is a blues for chamber ensemble that means to write into local history this event that happened on April 4, 1968, wherein my uncle killed a man, a white man, in revenge for King's assassination. I premiered that piece in Tarnac a couple years back, a sketch of it, and talked with people there. So the people in this area of France have a strong resistance history. The French resistance during the Second World War, there's a lot of pride around resistance. And so we were talking about sort of the history and the legacy of Black power and Black cultural resistance and political resistance in dialogue with French resistance.
Yeah.
There's a nationwide strike in France right now.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, these are people who are receptive to it. They don't have the myth of American democracy to kind of be the barrier between them and the truth. And so,
Yeah.
so they're open and willing to talk about what's real. And that's one of resistance is part of it. And then France, as you noted, has a long history of welcoming African Americans that, despite their horrendous colonial legacy,
Sure.
in places like Algeria especially.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
That despite that, I was interviewed by a magazine in France, and they asked me, how is it coming to France? I said, well, I'm not a woman. I'm not queer. I'm not visibly Jewish. I'm not visibly Muslim. And so I'd say, and I'm a jazz musician. And so I'd say it's pretty good. They like me here in France.
Yeah.
Can we talk about that word a little bit, about the separation between jazz musician, classical musician, and how that term jazz musician can kind of have like an othering
Thank you.
effect?
Yeah. So I use it's a placeholder, jazz. It is a marketing term that was cemented sometime at around the time that Jelly Roll Morton and Alan Lomax got together, and Alan Lomax, in exchange for a bottle of whiskey, told Jelly Roll Morton to play piano and tell him stories. And he told him stories about Storyville and New Orleans, and he called it jazz, and he explained what it meant in the context of the sex industry. And so it stuck. And some people don't talk about it in terms, Black people in particular don't talk about it in terms of jazz. It's just one facet. It is one of the genres of great Black music.
Yeah.
And so when classical people talk about jazz, when they've spoken with me about it, I've heard them refer to it as the genres, the types. Again, difference. What they would claim to be about is something more objective and universal that draws from all music, whereas jazz drew from simple pop song forms, blues, ballad tradition, Anglo ballad tradition, in order to generate, back in during the Harlem Renaissance in the 40s and the period of the Second World War, pop music, popular music that young people might consume.
Right.
Those of us who are students of that and are the legacy of that identify with it as high art. Of the stature of a so-called classical musician. I also, though, I wouldn't, I don't want to pretend to have been always woke or hip, the old
Sure.
woke. Had to encounter thinking of myself as inferior, as someone playing traditional music, surrounded by people who were playing, again, music that they would claim to have been more objective. I was enamored with modern classical music, composers like Xenakis and Feldman and Cage,
Oh, wow.
And Stockhausen and Lachman and all sorts of people, and I still am to some degree. And you take the concert with Sun Ra and John Cage as perhaps a representative anecdote of this struggle. These were two people who thought of themselves as equally brilliant geniuses who went along with the gig for the because it was a pay date, and they had this sort of kind of provisional respect for the other, but really didn't take one another seriously. When they parted, they was I'm going to go back and do my thing, and I'll let Cage, I'll let Ra do his thing, and we'll agree to disagree.
Yeah, and I can't help but to think about that situation. That sort of collaboration fitting under the umbrella of quote unquote classical, because someone on the stage is white. I'll just say that. I think about the relationship, Duke Ellington's name has come up a lot. I think about the relationship between Ellington's music and Gershwin's music, and which of those two composers we put into the classical quote unquote category.
Which one gets into our playlist?
Right, exactly. And how that perpetuates ideas surrounding the perceived differences in those genres. And, if you want to even go further, where that music is performed. Gershwin is in the concert halls. Ellington is in the speakeasies, and maybe not so much today. His music is being respected more. But again, it's important to acknowledge that history and that historical relationship as it applies to this topic specifically. I mean, I wonder if you consider that a bad word, because jazz improviser, I feel like, is a phrase that I've heard you use when you're identifying yourself.
It only as a placeholder. I mean, it's convenient. That serves other people, not me. That term. I don't. But also, I spent a lot of time arguing with my elders in my head from coming out of the Black Arts Movement, who were trying to evade the term because they thought it was racist. And I thought, well, no, claim it, because as someone who comes from blues people, as Baraka would have said it, Leroy Jones, aka Mary Baraka, I'm someone, which is to say, someone who's not repressed and is not worried about the sins that my family has committed by, working in the sex industry or being impoverished. That legacy, that part of the music's history, is absolutely essential in terms of the music's authenticity for me. It's one thing, Dave Brubeck, jazz goes to college and sublimated, so it's somehow better. That's the same thing people said about Ellington.
Sure.
Right?
Sure.
And he played the jungle music card too. I mean, or black classical. So it's not just jungle music, it's black classical. Stop with the name calling. Listen. And when you find yourself alienated, go listen to something else. Or ask why.
Sure.
Yeah, that's what I tell my students particularly when they encounter poetry. Well, think about what the barriers to your comprehension are, rather than just canning it and just setting it aside. I can't do this.
Yeah.
This isn't for me. This is alienating. The author did something wrong. No, what are the barriers? What are the barriers to you in particular engaging with this thing that you're too quick to call a name?
Yeah.
So you can put it somewhere,
right,
in the order, in the great chain of being. Where does this thing fit? And when black people's signature is on it, it tends to fit in a very specific place in this country's that this country has provided for it.
And that's a conversation we could go in forever, because right now, when you say that, I'm thinking about the latest Grammys, in which Tyler, the Creator, won Best Rap Album, but it wasn't really a rap album. It was music that they couldn't really categorize. So because blackness was attached to it, it was a rap album.
Why do you think both of you, why do you think we rely so heavily on dividing up styles of music and trying to identify them as different?
Well, I mean, you say we, and you have Davu, you have a much, the depth of your experience in this is much deeper than mine, I know. But I'm thinking back to my childhood. I'm thinking about listening to going to church and listening to spirituals. I'm thinking about turning on the radio back in those days and hearing Queen Latifah, Naughty by Nature. I'm thinking about the bits I learned about Black classical, including, some of that old piano music. We talk about Nathaniel Dett a lot these days.
Right.
For me, there was no need to segment all of that because it was just all a part of my Black musical experience. But when you throw in capitalism, when you throw in all sorts of other things, I feel like that's where those dissections come in.
Good point. One of the ironies about today is that in the effort to try to speak to a Black audience directly, right? The exploitation of after the 60s, we got a Black radio station out of it, right? KMOJ Radio, which used to operate out of the housing projects on the north side, was the radio station I grew up listening to. People ask me, did you grow up with music in the house? Yeah, on the radio. We danced to the radio in the house. You turn it up, and it was the only radio we listened to. I tell younger people, younger than millennials, no, there was a Black radio station that was the only Black radio station, and that's all we listened to. So think about how that
and the
orients
diversity
you.
of the music within
Exactly.
that.
Good point. Good point. Depending on the day of the week, depending on the time of the day,
Yeah.
it was like you got the whole archive represented there, right? Mediated by news that was relevant to Black people.
Right, exactly.
Right, that sort of thing. There was a time when that was normal. The way that capital has developed toward wherever it's heading. And now there's those they call it binary distinctions that were supposed to be bigger than now are they're gone. And those of us who are old enough to remember have to say no, but there's a reason why we call it Black music. There's a reason why the musician is talking about being Black.
Yeah.
There's a reason why race is so central to that Tyler, the Creator's articulation of who he is, despite the genre.
Yeah.
And and we have to keep telling. We have to keep telling. I'll go back though in terms of why do people need to compartmentalize? I think it's about diversity. It's anxiety born out of diversity. It's over 2,000 years ago, there was a Shakyamuni the Buddha said as much. It goes back for a very long time. The observation that people, when Gilgamesh and his people build a wall around the city in Mesopotamia, it is to keep out difference. The Hebrew Bible, the same problem, right? The problem of difference, those from without. What do you do with someone who does not speak like you, think like you, talk like you, eats what you eat?
Keep them out.
You keep them out, or you find a place for them. That is their place. You draw boundaries around it. Here's your place. This is where the Jews live. For now, then it'll be St. Louis Park and New Hope. But for now, it's around Sumner Field. Right? We'll tell you when you can go, right? You draw boundaries around it because it makes you, the one in power, more comfortable.
Under the guise of safety.
But to bring back that metaphor of gardening, there are walls that are built to protect what's inside. You don't want rabbits eating up your tomatoes.
Good point. There's a dynamic tension between the two. Good point. I'm glad you said that because I don't want it to sound as if there is only one way to think about this. I think the walls, what's the fences make good neighbors?
Something like that.
Frost or Robert Frost, I believe.
Over in my neighborhood, that's the case.
Indeed. I built a fence in my backyard when I started gardening, and my neighbor stopped talking to me because he assumed that it meant I didn't want to talk to him. And I said, no, I just want to occasionally be able to sit in my fake Adirondack chair because I can't afford the real ones, and sit without being stared at all the time.
Sure. Well, I'm not going to ask you to categorize the music that of yours that we're about to hear. But before I ask you to describe it, I kind of want to loop all the way back around to the first thing we were talking about, institutional involvement. And Scott, you've asked Paviel, about the way our institution, is seen in those circles. I wonder if you would ask Davu the same question.
Yeah, I think there's a misconception that public radio has an openness to all. And yet I'm finding out through being part of this podcast that there are certain people and indeed segments around the city that do not feel included in, or that it's, I don't want to say that it's not necessarily a welcoming place, but that NPR has not given attention to certain corners. Do you find that? Did you feel it?
I would say yes, and it's not just black people. It's also a large number of white people. And I say that as someone who listens to public radio.
Sure. Yeah.
And I'm not sure what's to be done about the matter. When you listen to KMLJ radio, you hear people who sound like you, who in some cases might think like you, in a lot of cases don't, talking about things that seem to have a direct impact on you. I'll take my one swipe at my favorite radio station, Minnesota Public Radio, and say that they don't talk about tote bags and coffee mugs or wine, book clubs and wine. They don't talk about those things. And so they talk about things that, again, that matter to people with less leisure time. So.
And, as a black person working for an institution like this, I find it to be my responsibility to make, what we're producing as broad as we can. And not necessarily as broad, but just making sure that I'm not forgetting about the communities that aren't always centered in the production of the things that happen here. And including this conversation, Davu, this has been really phenomenal. Go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you. And I would just say that you and I, Garrett, our presence here is an indication of the fact that you and I are bicultural. We have done more work to come to this y'all's way, right? We've had to do more work to come y'all's way. And so but that means that, maybe we shouldn't have black people on because black people don't listen. No, some of us know your world as well as we know our own.
Right.
And so, bring us on because we know that world too. And adding us to the conversation, I think helps to keep us all honest.
Yeah. Talk to us about this music we're about to hear.
So I'm going to play some drums, and deVon Gray, my good brother from Rondo. I live in Frogtown. We're just across University Avenue from one another. He's going to play bassoon. We're going to improvise based, I guess the text, the score, the page would be the relationship we've developed over the last handful of years as individuals, but then also our pedigrees as trained and untrained listeners.
Yeah, again, you are not a page. I am not a page.
Word.
I think that's what I'm going to call this
Word.
one.
Not a page?
Yeah, I am not a page. As Davu just so beautifully said, I'm going to live with that.
Shout out to
for a
Alan
while
Page.
now. Shout out to Alan Page. Davu, thank you so much. This has really been great.
Thanks, Davu.
Thank you.